To continue with the second part of this video, like I have mentioned, we can know of things with a reasonable degree of certainty, but not perhaps with an absolute degree of certainty. And the matter of the fact is that when you study different ideas and you study different conflicting principles, beyond a certain point, it does become very difficult, at the very least, to prove to the other side that you are right and they are wrong. Or it's very difficult to establish with absolute certainty that a certain principle is stronger or more conducive to the truth than another. Of course, I have said before that a lot of these intellectual conflicts at a certain point become this kind of semantic trench warfare, and it's very difficult at times to prove one principle over another. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that, certain things aren't more true than others, or that, certain things aren't correct whilst other things are false. This is more so in relation to the fact that, of course, as human beings, our knowledge is fallible and there are infinite number of proofs for everything. So, whilst I'm not necessarily this kind of postmodernist thinker, I can appreciate where the postmodernists are coming from, or where those who are more skeptical of our ability to know things with certainty, I can appreciate where they are coming from, because they are coming from a place where they're acknowledging the basic human capability of, or the basic human incapability rather, of knowing absolute truth in its fullest picture or its fullest extent. However, I do think that healthy skepticism can get twisted or degenerate into something which shouldn't really be considered healthy, perhaps, which is, the claim that there is no objective truth, or to be skeptical of absolutely every single piece of information or reality. So again, we can obtain truth, or we can obtain certain truths or certain approximations to the truth to a reasonable degree of certainty. And I don't think it abdicates the kind of responsibility on behalf of those who study or learn to try and obtain these truths. But of course, claims should be met with skepticism naturally. And I think the study of history shows that, history is the destroyer of narratives. History is the destroyer of those ideas which people construct. And it's important then to note that, one shouldn't obviously be dogmatic, one shouldn't be overzealous, one should appreciate different ideas with an open mind and try and figure them out to the best of his capabilities, or her capabilities rather. This actually does bring up another point, that of individualism and tradition. Of course, there are two distinct threads that I think a lot of people do get caught up with, and I think I have tried to grapple with and have struggled with. On the one hand, every society has a kind of tradition, right? Every society has some kind of basic set of social beliefs or customs that they adhere to. And the historical reality is that you don't question these traditions, you don't question these customs. And if you do, at the very least, you're like socially ostracized, and at the very worst, you're persecuted. And this is the reality of every single society, whether, it be a liberal society, a Marxist society, a pre-modern religious or feudal society. In one way or another, they all have these kinds of mechanisms in place. And the difficult thing to acknowledge is it's a very natural thing, and it probably is something inherent to every single human society thus far, and perhaps will continue to be so in the future. Now, this obviously contradicts or contrasts with our common conceptions of individualism, or even more philosophical conceptions of it. And it's important to note, of course, the other alternative historical reality, which is that throughout time and place, individuals have, oftentimes been repressed or oppressed and subsumed into the collective whole. And at times when perhaps certain groups or certain individuals were persecuted, or they were censored, right, by the state or by certain groups, history seems to vindicate these people, right? History seems to vindicate the ideas of these groups, of these people. This isn't just some simplistic, the good guys, always win out in history. That's never really the case, but it's more so the fact that, when you look back throughout history and you see, certain groups of people being persecuted, first of all, at times when you really understand the ideas that are being argued, or you understand the actual intellectual conflicts, at times it can seem rather absurd why they would be persecuting each other. At other times you can understand why they disagree with each other so vehemently, but you perhaps don't seem to understand why they were so, aggressive to one another to the point where they were willing to take each other's lives, even. And, this common theme seems to be the case that history, when you look back throughout history and you see these cases of certain individuals, certain peoples being persecuted, for their beliefs or for their identity, that stuff, that kind of persecution just seems rather absurd, right? But it's important to note that it's very much context based. If we were based within the context of that time, would we have been any better? I mean, in our societies, of course, we are very much bound within the context, let's say, for example, of supporting certain secular ideologies, certain secular humanist ideologies, right? And, these conflicts, although quite arbitrary, at a certain point, before that certain point, they are very real because they engulf the lives of millions of people. I think the important point to be made here is that you can't truly have liberty without some kind of order. You can't have liberty without some kind of tradition. And although I am more sympathetic to the individualist camp because, like I said, I don't think the individual should be, subsumed within the collective whole. And it, in fact, is within the interest of the collective to maintain the rights of the individual. I think it's important to know that ultimately liberty isn't without responsibility or without consequence. And ultimately, at the end of the day, every single society has some kind of tradition, right? They have some set of values or beliefs or customs which you don't question. And if you do, you are ostracized. I think this is just the reality of every human society. You can see this as a kind of necessary evil, perhaps. You can see this as a good or a bad thing, but it's just the reality of, human existence. Humanity is always in conflict with one another on the basis of one thing or another. And there comes a point, where they may be unwilling to compromise on a certain issue. And so, it's really just the case that every generation, I guess you could say, has its own battle, insofar as each generation has to struggle to figure out what aspects, what things to reinforce and what things to challenge. And this is, I guess, a constant kind of battle for each generation and each society. This isn't necessarily some kind of progressive argument, but more so is just stating the basic fact about human societies and how these human societies undergo changes or maintain certain things, right? Either they change or they remain continuous. And this does bring me back to the point about the postmodernists. I think what the postmodernists perhaps won't appreciate is that tradition is inevitable, perhaps, in every human society. And in that case, in a postmodern era, in an era where traditional values break down, a return to tradition is inevitable and perhaps even necessary. Because if you deconstruct everything, if you deconstruct social constructs, if you deconstruct, the artificial beliefs that we hold or the artificial customs that we have produced over time, what you end up reaching is the basic essence or reality upon which those social constructions are based. And so once you reach the core, you have no choice but to reconstruct from the ground up, so to speak. And so you have no choice but to restore some kind of tradition. You have no choice but to restore some kind of semblance of traditional values. Again, we don't necessarily have to produce a tradition which is oppressive or repressive to the individual or is irrational. We can try and produce, to the best of our capabilities, a tradition which is rational, which is based on reason and justice and virtue, which is conducive to fulfillment and, let's say, the betterment of a society. But inevitably, like with every tradition, it will stagnate, it will degenerate, and then it will be the job of future generations to deal with those problems and, restore some kind of order, restore some kind of new semblance of some kind of tradition once more. And I think, like I said, this is ultimately a battle, a kind of struggle that every generation has to go through. I mean, the Gen Z kind of generation, my generation, is currently undergoing this political and social struggle with the dominant boomer kind of liberal consensus order, right? And it's obvious to us that there are certain failings in that which the boomers haven't acknowledged yet. And so ultimately, when we come in power, most likely there are certain aspects of the political and social order that we will be inclined to change. And similarly, when our grandchildren will grow up and they will see the problems that will arise in the political order that we establish, they will similarly, strive to change it and so on and so forth. Of course, like I said, we can try and maintain individualism, rationality, liberty within these traditions, but these values precisely have to be operationalized within the context of said tradition. I was reading an interesting post from the reactionary articleist Imperium Press, and he mentioned that, you know, what we want is to restore tradition, and postmodernism inevitably leads back to tradition. And he uses the language of restoration rather than revolution. And what I would actually venture to say and use is that Islam, or the Islamic faith, right, it is the fundamental and most precise and authentic form of restoration, because it restores man to that which is most primordial, right, to his natural disposition, his fitrah, which is to worship one God and to understand that God through the laws of reason and through the laws of revelation, and to use both of these, to use knowledge to understand the world, to reach the divine, and that he has sent messengers throughout every time and place. And like I've said in previous videos, this is the core message of the Islamic faith, which I agree with. And so, just on that basis alone, one could argue that Islam, or the Islamic faith, restores man to his primal disposition. Of course, you could disagree with this and you may have other ideas of what traditions are more suitable. But for me, I think that, within my context especially, that is the most suitable thing to suggest. And for others, of course, they may have their respective traditions which they want to restore. Now, of course, like I've said, such traditions should operationalize the values of liberty, the values of rationality, the values of justice and virtue, and not to be repressive or oppressive. But it's precisely the fact that these values have to be operationalized within the context of these traditions. So, just to further reinforce this point, I do see value in the kind of postmodernist deconstructionist analysis, because it allows us to break down the kinds of narratives that we've constructed in society or have developed over the course of history. It allows us to break these down. We can break these down and we can separate the socially constructed or the artificial from the essence, from the basic reality at the core of that thing. But once we reach the core reality, we have no choice but to reconstruct based on that core reality, so to speak. And so I do think the postmodernist deconstructionist kind of analysis has its benefits. It does have a lot of good within it. And I have suggested that we should take a kind of socio-hermeneutic approach to understanding postmodernism. But inevitably, postmodernism does lead back to some kind of tradition in one way or another.